Good afternoon. I want to draw you back to the setting of the first lecture in this series of Lees Knowles Lectures. The setting of these lectures is the Peace Conference at Lausanne, convened on the 20th of November 1922, almost precisely a century ago. And I want to ask you to consider the interpretation of these four lectures as happening, being formed through an understanding of what went on in that moment when the Great War came to an end. 1918, as I think most historians now recognize, is a stage on the way to further violence, decentralized violence, and what I call civilianized violence. The three countries whose national aspirations were at stake at Lausanne were Turkey, Greece, and Armenia. There were imperial futures to be determined as well, but these national ones were at the core. I begin with Turkey today and engage with the claim that since 1918, wars of self-determination separated from democracy, like that of Turkey between 1919 and 1922, all too frequently turn into wars against civilians. And the Turkish-Greek War of 1919 to 22 was marked by its specific targeting of civilian populations on both sides. My subject today is what I might term the dark side of the Wilsonian moment. That term was coined by historian Erez Manela, and his theme is not the trajectory of Woodrow Wilson's ideas about self-determination, nor is it the way that self-determination informed the framing of the peace. He's interested instead in the escape of self-determination from the control of the dominant world powers in the period after 1917. Once out of Wilson's control, the idea of self-determination took on a life of its own. It helped spark uprisings of subjugated populations in the Middle East and in Asia, where there were violent protests against their being denied self-determination in 1919 and after. And this spread from Cairo to Beijing. The Wilsonian moment, in Manela's terms, was a time of anti-colonial and anti-imperial mobilization throughout the world. Some have criticized Manela for ignoring earlier sources of the idea of self-determination. In other words, Turkey didn't need Woodrow Wilson to develop this argument, and other non-Western ideas that propelled forward anti-imperial movements. Still, his work has drawn attention to the multiple meanings and political uses of the term self-determination in the decade of the Great War and its aftermath. Today, what I want to show is the malleability of the idea of self-determination and its use by, in particular, the Turkish delegation at Lausanne in driving home their case for independence and sovereignty. Self-determination, though, meant more than that. It justified a war against minorities within the emerging state. Self-determination was part of the process of the civilianization of war. I think we confront one of the major errors of Wilson and other peacemakers of the period 1918 to 1922. Time and again, they use the term self-determination as a symbol of national aspirations without linking that demand to democracy and to the protection of minorities. The League of Nations had a major investment in the protection of minorities, but did not have the power or the ability to realize it. The peace at Lausanne of 1923 was disfigured by this omission. What the leaders of Turkey, Mustafa İsmet, who was the leader of the Turkish delegation in Lausanne, and Mustafa Kemal, his boss in Ankara, what they did in 1922-23, Hitler did in Czechoslovakia 15 years later. They severed the idea of self-determination from the commitment to democracy, and in particular from the protection of ethnic or religious minorities. In this second lecture of the series on the civilianization of war, and once again I can apprise you of the pattern. In this, the second of these four lectures on the civilianization of war, I trace the course of the disastrous appropriation of the category of self-determination for blatantly undemocratic, violent, and ethnically defined aims and ends. Wilson himself directly addressed the problem of imperialism in the Middle East. That was the framework for his comments on self-determination. The dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire was the 12th of Wilson's 14 points. In January 1918, Wilson declared, quote, "The Turkish portion of the present Ottoman Empire should be assured a secure sovereignty, but other nationalities which are now under Ottoman rule should be assured an undoubted security of life and an unmolested opportunity of autonomous development." Between the lines was the Armenian genocide, but not only that. On the 9th of November 1918, Britain and France followed Wilson's lead and promised to liberate the peoples under Ottoman domination who would now be able to exercise self-determination, specifically stated as their war objective too. Now, the Treaty of Sèvres had other things in mind. It was signed in August 1920. The delay between the end of the war and the framing of the Treaty of Sèvres is a story in the history of imperialism, very interesting, and in some respects, a perfect example of the need to strike while the iron is hot, because by the time the Treaty of Sèvres was framed, and this is what it looked like, by the time it was framed, the world of self-determination had turned into the world of imperial carve-up. This treaty was never ratified. It was signed, but it was not ratified. And it is the failure of this treaty that led to war between Greece and Turkey, and ultimately to the peace treaty replacing it at Lausanne, the subject of these lectures. Now, in many respects, what we can see is that this map shows a Wilsonian direction by detaching from Anatolia and Thrace territories under the control of the defunct Ottoman Empire. I mean, what we can see here, very straightforwardly, is Turkey is separated from an orange or orange-yellow segment under international authority, a dark blue segment under Greek authority, a light blue segment under French authority, a red segment under British authority, and an Armenian state in purple. That was an Armenian republic specified, although with borders to be drawn up with the help of President Wilson in the future. This is as close to an imperial carve-up as you will see in the aftermath of the First World War. It looks a bit like what happened to Hungary, which was reduced in size by 3/4 in the course of negotiations. It is, in some respects, dependent upon one thing and one thing alone: the purchase of Armenian independence at the price of the strengthening of imperial spheres of influence. Oh, I forgot to mention the green of Italy down at the bottom. Just to add a phrase which will clarify the military history later, the blue area, the Greek area, which was the plan of the Prime Minister of Greece, Eleftherios Venizelos, was established in 1919 through an invasion landing at Smyrna. And roughly 50 kilometers to the east of that, there was a Greek zone of influence that would have been made permanent by the Treaty of Sèvres. That zone of influence grew over time and caused enormous military trouble. I'll come to it later on. The idea of blocking, as you can see, blocking the Italian sphere by a Greek invasion tells us something about the, shall we say, chaos of Western planning in 1919 during the peace treaty, because the Italian government walked out of the negotiations in Paris because they refused access to the western coast of what became Yugoslavia. In peak, the Italian Navy occupied the southern part of Anatolia. The Allies then decided to give Greece their share in order to block the Italian advance. Hence, the notion of self-determination, as you can see, seems to be a footnote in the story of the construction of imperial designs in 1918, 19, and 20. Now, the sovereignty of the new Turkish state was to be limited in every single way. As you can see, the international zone surrounding Constantinople and the Bosphorus stopped the Turkish state from being a European state. It remained entirely Asiatic, which is the way in which Curzon thought it should be controlled. The second point is that the number of soldiers and sailors Turkey could mobilize was strictly limited, and in addition, its finances were put under direct Allied supervision. In addition, the system of capitulations was restored. These were grants to Christian traders and trading nations and had been abolished by Turkey in 1914. 7 years later, the new Ottoman Turkish state was, in effect, with the Treaty of Sèvres, a puppet of the victorious Allies. Having lost the war, the Turkish state had lost the right to self-determination. It is this settlement against which Turkish nationalists fought and won. It was a question constantly, which is the war that was being ended at Lausanne? Was it the 1919-22 war about this map, or was it the 1914-1918 war extended because of the lack of a peace treaty from 1919 to 22? Ultimately, the answer was that this solution to ending the state of hostilities that had begun in 1914 was unworkable and had to be replaced. The Peace Conference of Lausanne was the way to do that. Now, I want to show you very briefly some elements that explain the quite natural response of Turkish intellectuals and political activists against the imperial carve-up of Anatolia. Very interesting novelist and friend, as you can see, of Mustafa Kemal, whose name was Halip Edip, later Adivar. She spoke time and again about the need to realize Wilsonian objectives in Turkey. In her memoir, published in English in 1928, this is what she wrote. Inspired and encouraged by the principles of Wilson, which had taken in the entire world of the defeated, a temporary association called the Wilsonian League was formed in Istanbul by a number of writers and publicists and lawyers. In the midst of blind hatred and the cry of no quarter to the defeated, the only gleam of justice and common sense seemed to come from these principles. Under the shadow of an ugly partition, the enlightened Turks naturally turned their eyes to President Wilson and America, which showed no desire for territorial acquisition in Turkey. Now, the United States was an honest broker for another reason. War had never been declared between the Ottoman Empire and America. The fight against Sèvres was against the Allies and not against President Wilson. The Wilsonian moment offered the defeated hope for a democratic future. That's what they claimed, that self-determination was democracy. Mustafa Kemal had other ideas of what democracy should be. Between 1920 and 22, opposition to the Sèvres Agreement grew among those Turks who no longer supported the Sultan and who wanted to exercise another kind of self-determination, an ethnic form of self-determination. To realize these objectives, they took up arms and by 1922 compelled the Allies to free Turkey from the shadows of Sèvres. This bouleversement was utterly unexpected. In fact, it is a unique moment in the history of the post-war period. As in every other peace treaty after 1918, an imperial power defeated in war signed a humiliating peace. But in Turkey, opponents of the Sultanate effectively usurped its authority and established a Republican assembly in Ankara, which they call the Grand National Assembly. And this was a group aiming at self-determination against the imperial coalition occupying Turkish land. In effect, Turkish Republicans hoisted the Allies by their own Wilsonian petard. They won that right on the battlefields of 1919 to 22 and were then invited by the Allies to rewrite the peace treaty in October 22. That is what will be celebrated in Turkey, if not elsewhere, next year. The vanquished had turned the tables on the victors. This lecture tells the story of how it all happened and traces some of the complex and deleterious consequences of the outcome. Let me be as clear as possible. The Turkish delegation at Lausanne had a selective and entirely self-serving definition of self-determination, one that did not extend to the Armenian or to the Kurdish people. The Turkish army had enforced that distinction on the battlefield, that only Turkish people had the right of self-determination, not any other group within Turkey. And the Allies had to go along with this exclusion. That is why I think it's interesting and maybe important to bring the optics of Manella's interpretation on the Wilsonian moment into the story. It helps us to see more clearly the strategies of the delegations meeting in Lausanne and the ambiguities of the settlement they reached. The first, though, but by no means the last, rewriting of the post-war settlement. This episode in peacemaking sheds considerable light, I think, on the difficulties and limitations of the term self-determination itself. Almost every self has several selves within. Those minorities have no right to maintain their right to self-determination in this story. Once self-determination is separated from democracy, then violence against minorities is inevitable. And this was the case in Turkey in 1922-23. Turkey's fight for self-determination was not a fight for democracy, but for ethnic nationalism. Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk, his use of violence to remove political enemies and to consolidate his hold on power is a well-known story. So is his use of the Greek invasion of Anatolia to justify the harshness of the treatment of civilians, Armenians, Greek Orthodox, and Kurds, by the armies under his own command. To Kemal and his allies, these people were enemies within, and having been abandoned by their imperial patrons, they became casualties in the post-1918 war over the shatter zones of empire. It was the civilians of minorities who paid the price for the establishment of ethnic nationalism and ethnic self-determination in Turkey. The Allies very soon, the French before the British, but the Italians were neck and neck with the French, I think. The Allies soon gave up any pretense of defending the rights of these minorities to self-determination. And as I claimed a week ago, the Allies' aim at the Treaty of Lausanne is to make it possible to have peace, not justice. What was euphemistically termed population exchange, that is, the forced expatriation of over 1 million Greek Orthodox residents of Turkey and several 100,000 Muslim residents of Greece, which I discussed last week, was the diametrical opposite of self-determination. These civilians had no choice in the matter. So much for human rights and a stable world order. Turning in today's lecture to the Turkish side of the story, we can see clearly that the Treaty of Lausanne set a terrible precedent for the future. The Turkish delegation at Lausanne was led by two men. Here they are in conversation. They became very important friends early on and stayed that way to the end of the life of Mustafa Kemal himself, first president of the Republic of Turkey. His successor was Mustafa İsmet, who took the name of İnönü, one of the battles that he successfully led in 1921. They had parallel military careers, these two, and they were by no means rivals. In the pre-war period, Kemal flirted with politics more than did İsmet, whose profile was more that of a military bureaucrat than a politician. Kemal joined the ruling Committee of Union and Progress, the CUP, though he never joined the circles around one of its leading members. He remained aloof from the CUP throughout his early and indeed his later life. He did share with many of these leaders of Turkey during the First World War the nationalist notions of Ziya Gökalp, but Kemal never entered the ruling circles of these ethnic nationalists. In Constantinople, at the end of the Lost War, after the signing of the Armistice in 1918, both men met and discussed in secret the way forward. They agreed that the Ottoman regime was responsible for the disaster, not the army, and that a new political order had to emerge to chart the future. At this time, in 1919, these words could only be spoken behind closed doors. By then, Mustafa Kemal had been named General Inspector of the Army, with the brief of organizing the demobilization agreed at Mudros, where Ottoman forces capitulated in November 1918. In fact, he did much more than that, turning demobilization into remobilization for a war not only against the Allies, but against his own Sultan. Initially, this campaign was shielded, as I said, by silence and subterfuge. After the Allied occupation of Constantinople in March 1920, Kemal instructed İsmet to leave the city and join him in a new political movement in Anatolia and in particular in Ankara. And there they both served on the Grand National Assembly, the new parliament, not in Constantinople, but in Ankara, That is why Ankara is the capital of Turkey today. Ismet was never a competitor to Mustafa Kemal, but neither was he Mustafa Kemal's puppet. The relationship between the two was that of agent and principal and remained so throughout their lives. Now for the Allies, what are they going to do with this unwinnable war for Sèvres? They can't win that war. They have to produce something else. The Allies used a heavy hand to force the Ottoman state to accept Sèvres. In February, they occupied Constantinople. In August, they forced the Sultan to sign, very, very reluctantly. He signed under duress. The treaty left a post-imperial Turkish government in control of only some of the central provinces of Anatolia. If you will, so much for even the superficial definition of self-determination for the Turkish nation. Just to show you, to make sure the point is vivid. Do you see the white area in the middle? That is Turkey. You can see why it was that Turkish nationalists considered Sèvres to be an abomination. For the victorious Allies, it is important to note that the longer they took to reach a peace settlement, the harder it was to enforce it. And the reason was economic. 1920 was the beginning of the interwar depression in Britain. The French economic position in 1919 and 1920 was severely weakened by the nationalization of foreign investments in Bolshevik Russia. 1/6 of the French portfolio of overseas investment was seized by the Bolsheviks. French investment suffered an enormous hit, and that hit the French rentier class, very close to the political class, where it hurt. In some ways, what happened was that the Allies lost the peace because they waited too long to establish a viable form of it. And yet, it's important for us to know that there were democratic elements in Sèvres. There was an Armenian republic. There was a promise to set up a Kurdish republic, yes, to be delayed and to be worked out, but it indicated that the population of Anatolia would have multiple ethnic lives determined by those who chose them, and not one under which other ethnicities could not affirm their right to self-determination. The truth remained that the old imperial world could not be resurrected fully, not even through the maneuvers of that elegant master of imperial power, the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Curzon. Not only were the imperial powers weakened economically by the war, but the post-war economic order in general was in a mess. And during the conference at Lausanne, what shall we call it, unprecedented and dizzying spiral of hyperinflation reached its peak in Germany. And at the same moment, the French and Belgians invaded the Rhineland in order to assure that reparations were to be paid. Economic instability made peacemaking almost impossible to run with a sense that there were alternatives other than capitulation to the Turkish side. I'll try to explain why capitulation happened. It led to a staggering and swift reversal of roles in diplomatic affairs. Turkey, the doormat on which Allied armies could wipe their feet before settling in for la longue durée of dominance, was replaced by the new Turkey, the scourge of invading armies camped on her soil. Self-determination was won by armed resistance and popular rejection of post-1918 imperial occupation. Lausanne was a conference that took place under this economic cloud, but also under other degrees of objection to the post-war settlement. We must beware of the fact of reading too much into it, but nonetheless, 6 months after the signing of the Treaty of Lausanne was the beer-hole putsch of Hitler and the Nazis in Munich. Well, how did this reversal happen militarily? First of all, as I said, the Greek landing at Smyrna took place in May 1919 and marked the beginning of a Turkish armed nationalist movement that 4 years later brought Mustafa Kemal and his supporters to power. In the words of the most distinguished historian of the conflict, Sir Michael Llewellyn Smith, Greek forces and administrators who had joined the war on the Allied side only in 1917, under Eleftherios Venizelos, exercised a civilizing mission and acted as the willing executor of the Allied will in controlling nationalist bands in Anatolia. When the Sultan and his government signed the treaty, in the eyes of the nationalists, including Mustafa Kemal, they thereby lost the right to govern. Having dissolved parliament on the 11th of April, the Sultan opened the door for a new assembly, the Grand National Assembly, to convene in Ankara and carry on the war. Even after Venizelos fell from power, we'll hear about this next week in November 1920, the Greek presence in Anatolia acted as the cutting edge of the dismemberment and domination of Turkey. This was Lloyd George's policy. It was a British policy carried out not by the British Army, but by the Greek Army. When on the 6th January 1921, the Greek Army met the forces mobilized by the Grand National Assembly under Mustafa Ismet near the Inonu railway station. Perhaps I can show you this more closely. The first areas you see around Izmir, then Smyrna, shows where the Greek invasion took place, roughly 50 kilometers around near Manisa and further north. Then there was a second attempt to push towards Ankara, where the Grand National Assembly was, in 1920 and 1921, and it was blocked at the first and second battles of Inonu. You can see where that is. The third attempt to destroy the Grand National Assembly and establish this, shall we say, post-nationalist peace took place at the Battle of Domlopar. That's a misspelling. It should be with a P rather than an O. Now, that battle, ultimately at the end of August 1922, destroyed the core of the Greek invading force. Roughly 300,000 men were trapped in the middle of Turkey. And just notice the military logic. Every single time there was a battle, and it was a draw, that is to say neither side won, it was a Turkish victory. Because like Russia in 1941, or if you will, in 1812, the further inland the Turkish forces drew, the longer were the lines of supply of the Greek invaders. Now, there's another story to tell about the insanity of the Greek war effort, and I'll tell that next week. But the real battle took place, as I said, about halfway between Ankara and Izmir. Can you see the triangle? Izmir, Istanbul, and Ankara? That is where the story of the end of the First World War took place. By August 1922, it was over. The Greek army had been entirely smashed, completely defeated, and in complete disarray. Approximately 50,000 Greek soldiers died in the course of that campaign, and 50,000 civilians died with them. When the Greek army fled to the sea, to Izmir, in boats to carry them back to Greece, they proceeded to take out their frustration on a series of over 1,000 Turkish Muslim villages. The civilianization of a war was a function of a number of features of war, but one of them was defeat. When they were pursued back to Smyrna and got on 52 different boats in order to get to Greece, they left around Smyrna a civilian population of over 200,000 refugees. You can imagine what the Turkish army did in response. I'll come back to that in a moment or two. This was a devastating blow, not only for Greece, but also for Britain and France. And one of the reasons why Lord George fell was his blind, almost stubborn commitment to have the Greek army succeed without providing the Greek army with either the arms or the finance necessary to do so. By mid-1922, the story of the war between Greece and Turkey had been completed. Let's return now to the victors. The two men, Ismet and Kemal, who masterminded Turkish victory, they weren't equals. Ismet was a professional soldier, as I said, a man who followed orders. He thought inside the box of a military bureaucracy and served the commander-in-chief loyally and effectively. Kemal was always his superior officer. When the Allies agreed to convene a new peace conference at Lausanne, Kemal saw it as the occasion to exercise his own domestic authority and send his military leader, his military agent, to Lausanne to complete the task of constructing an independent Turkey. And that is what the Treaty of Lausanne succeeded in doing. At the official opening of the Lausanne Peace Conference on 20 November 1922, İsmet, the head of the Turkish delegation, addressed the assembly in these words: "Gentlemen, an armistice concluded more than 4 years ago on the basis of and in belief in the principles of President Wilson officially suspended the hostilities in which the Ottoman Empire found itself engaged. İsmet now asked the delegates to seize the Wilsonian moment and to turn the armistice not into an act of neo-imperialism, but of recognition of the sovereignty of the new Turkish Muslim nation. He was able to make this claim because the Turkish people, deprived of the benefits of peace, had found the courage to defend themselves through their own moral and material resources. And they had won that battle in the face of Allied occupation and the military attacks of the Greek army intended to force them to accept humiliating terms. Turks of every age and condition," he added, "have contributed to this defensive struggle." And here again we see the recognition of what it meant to civilianize war. This is the city of Smyrna on fire from a French cruiser. The French and the British navies were committed to maintaining the peace, but not to evacuating the civilian populations. There were evacuations, but they were not official policy at the time. That's why the photographs that we have of this catastrophic event are heavily dominated by naval vessels of the British and the French fleets. Let me go back here. Right. If you will, the Turkish nation, said İsmet, has conquered its place in civilized mankind with all those rights to existence and independence which are inherent in nations capable of a vigorous vitality. The highest aim of the Grand National Assembly of Turkey is to maintain and consolidate this position. This is almost word for word a way of describing Lausanne as a Wilsonian moment, leading to the peace treaty signed on the 24th of July, 1923. The delegation at Lausanne performed the sovereignty and independence of the new regime. The new Turkish Republic was proclaimed with Ankara as its capital and Mustafa Kemal as its president 3 months after the signing of the peace treaty. Now, these formalities followed the true birth of the Turkish state on the day the Lausanne Conference opened, almost precisely a century ago. That conference, in many respects, left as its example a way in which the defeated powers can turn the table on the victorious powers by transforming into victory the culture of defeat, in Schivelbusch's terms. In every other peace conference following the war, the losers had their sovereignty reduced or redefined in deleterious and humiliating ways. Their borders were redrawn, their citizens or subjects distributed to either new states, and their right to organize national defense was strictly curtailed. They had to accept occupation by foreign troops, but not for Turkey at Lausanne, because the Allies had agreed to recognize the Grand National Assembly, not the Sultan, as the legitimate authority of Turkey. 6 days later, on 17 November 1922, the Sultan fled Constantinople for a life of luxurious exile. Thus, the entire conference was a performance of the legitimacy of the new Turkish state. Now, İsmet's intervention in the proceedings were all framed to broadcast and reinforce this state of affairs. What I think makes it extraordinary is the notion that when Fridtjof Nansen, as I said last time, found his way to Lausanne to ask the delegates to accept the population exchange as a compulsory agreement, the person who didn't want to listen to it and said so in public was Mustafa İsmet. He replied to Nansen's address, and he raised an objection to his presence. Why? Because the sovereign state of Turkey was not a member of the League of Nations, and thus the League and its representatives, Nansen, had no standing in these proceedings to end the state of war that had broken out in 1914. Nansen remarked, İsmet added, would be treated as those of a private individual. Throughout the deliberations at Lausanne, the Turkish delegation blocked Allied attempts to keep Turkey in a subordinate position. That came out most clearly on the 4th of February 1923 when İsmet refused to sign the draft treaty. This precipitated a British walkout. Lord Curzon, who was ill at the time and perhaps not made to feel any better by the fact that the Conservative Party had passed him by in the choice for a new leader, Lord Curzon washed his hands of the proceedings and left it to his juniors to finish the peace treaty. Mustafa İsmet was able to sign exactly the treaty that he wanted. Now, I think one of the things that is most intriguing about this story, in many ways, is the way in which the concept of self-determination was twisted and reinterpreted at the peace treaty ending the First World War. In some sense, what we have to understand is that as the, alas, almost forgotten German political science Eckhard Kehr, who died very early, established that domestic politics and foreign policy are symbiotically related to each other. And at Lausanne, what Kemal had won was not only sovereignty and self-determination, but the capacity to organize a non-democratic system of power in Turkey itself. One of the most prominent opponents of İsmet's leadership at Lausanne was a man named Ali Shukru, who was member of parliament for Trabzon in the north. He went so far as to say that Turkish victory had been wasted at Lausanne. He was against the settlement. No one had the slightest doubt that Shukru's target was not İsmet, but his boss, Mustafa Kemal. 3 weeks later, Ali Shukru was abducted and murdered. The killer turned out to be one of Mustafa Kemal's own bodyguards, following the orders of his commander, Osman Aga. The commander of the man who did the killing, Aga, was then executed, and his body was hung in front of the Grand National Assembly for 3 hours. Now this, which by the way does make me think a little bit of what happened in Istanbul, shall we say, partly at the responsibility of the current leader of Saudi Arabia. But the establishment of, shall we say, the right to kill an opponent of the regime was done in the middle of the negotiations about whether the Treaty of Lausanne should be signed or not. The construction of the dictatorship and the destruction of ethnic self-determination happened hand in hand. Of course, this form of rough justice drew a veil over the incident. Opponents of Kemal were outraged, but they were outmaneuvered. Now, during this pause of March 1923, which after Curzon's walkout was inevitable, this was a moment where what Mustafa Kemal was able to do was to consolidate his hold on domestic politics. And he sent İsmet back to Lausanne with a remit to sign the treaty. Therefore, he showed the foreign political power to determine his will as opposed to the Allies, at the same time as he eliminated any alternative to his rule domestically. He sent İsmet back to Lausanne to sign the treaty, and the bond between the two men had never been deeper. In September 1922, while in Smyrna, still called Smyrna instead of Izmir, that's named today, Mustafa Kemal had met and fallen in love with Latifa Hanim, whom he married on the 29th of January 1923, during this difficult period of a pause. From Lausanne, İsmet sent Mustafa Kemal as a gift the wedding ring that he used, arriving just in time. Now, the peace treaty signed on the 24th of July 1923 exposed the contradictions and dangers embedded in the notion of self-determination. Let me just try to draw out 2 or 3 conclusions from this analysis. Self-determination became a zero-sum game, not a right for all subjected peoples between 1918 and 23. One group had it, another group lost it. The group that lost it were exposed to violence. That is what has occurred time and again in the course of the 20th century. Turkey only joined the League in 1932, but whatever the League of Nations said about self-determination, in Lausanne in 1923, as in Munich in 1938, the final meaning of the term was set by sovereign states and not by the League. In addition, the Turkish Republic was born out of Lausanne, and it was in no sense democratic. Self-determination for Wilson was the business of democracies. He used an American model of development, obviously not relevant in this particular context. The new Turkish regime was hardly democratic, and there was more than a touch of cynicism in Ismet and Kemal's embrace of the term self-determination. To be sure, there were Turkish sources to Kemal's assertion of national pride, but in the context of peacemaking after the Great War, to adhere to a belief in self-determination was good diplomatic strategy. If we had to define with as much precision as possible who is the self promoting self-determination in Turkey in 1923, that answer would be one man, Mustafa Kemal. His selfhood established the republic in the name of his people, and only his people. Self-determination without democracy, I believe, following Hannah Arendt, is a recipe for authoritarian politics. No one could possibly claim that the population exchange clauses of the peace conference at Lausanne were democratic. The Turkish Republic was an authoritarian and illiberal state from the start. It remains so today. Mustafa Kemal and Mustafa Ismet had no difficulty in accepting the idea of stripping law-abiding Greek Orthodox citizens of Turkey of their right to reside in the country in which they and their ancestors had lived for centuries. They denied to the Armenians and to the Kurdish people the same right to self-determination they embraced so fiercely for Muslim Turks. At Lausanne in 1923, and not for the last time, the ambiguities and contradictions embedded in the notion of self-determination were exposed for all to see. It probably is true to say that I'm not an admirer of President Wilson, but I do believe that his tragedy was to see the destruction of his idea of self-determination in his last years. He died in 1924, as indeed did Lenin. Now, the new Turkish regime waged a war for independence predicated on ethnic nationalism. The war they won against the Greek army was waged as well against Greek civilians, that is to say, Greek Orthodox residents of Turkey. As we shall see in the third lecture next week, the Greek army in Anatolia was also guilty of civilianizing war. All those caught in the cauldron of armed conflict after 1918 were living in a new kind of warfare, a degenerate kind of war, I believe, a form of warfare we still know today. There are many, many different libraries of photographic images of the period after 1918. Have we simply joined them? The refugees fleeing war in Ukraine, and below from the war in Syria. There are different nationalities, different skin color, different religions, but are they not part of the same story of the civilianization of war? I started my remarks last week in making a claim that the war that Vladimir Putin is waging in Ukraine is a continuation of a pattern that was set in the years after 1918. I want to return to that argument today. It seems to me that without a democratic vision of a peace treaty in which minorities are protected, warfare or civil war will turn into violence against civilians, inevitably. The warfare that broke out in the civil war in Syria in 2012 was very little different from the war that Putin is waging today. I think it is fair to say that the West in general, if we can still use that word, has let him get away with it in Syria. Is the same true in Ukraine? Perhaps not. One important point, though, is that what we see is that self-determination is no defense against ethnic cleansing, as long as the self is defined in unitary and zero-sum ways. The Wilsonian moment, I believe, turned into a leap into a violent and an authoritarian future, one with which we are all too familiar today. Does the civilianization of war have an answer in international law? Perhaps it does, and there are scholars today working on this particular principle. But if we look at the years 1918 to 23, we can see that the attempt to establish a peace treaty on the basis of nationalism of an ethnic kind is bound to result in violence against men, women, and children. The war that Putin is waging in Ukraine has ethnic elements in it. He's imported them. He's invented them. He's distorted them. In some respects, he has drawn them out of a series of historical claims that cannot possibly be sustained. But I urge you simply to say that he is by no means alone. He has a very long history upon which to draw. And one of those histories is the period of warfare between 1918 to 22, a period of warfare in which more people died than those that perished in the period 1914 to 1918. It is well for us, I think, to place contemporary concerns about warfare not far away from us in an historical context that is worrying and alarming to this day. The final point I want to make is simply this, that the way in which the new Turkish regime waged a war for independence is all too similar to wars of self-determination in other parts of the world. I will try to draw some comments about the extent to which civilianization of war is part of its globalization in my next lecture. Thank you very much.